Good morning, everybody. I know that I haven't been on tape for a while, so I'm going to say hello and give you a few more ideas, suggestions, and have a little chat. So first of all, I want to find out if everybody is on TaskStream. Most of you have emailed me, but if you're still struggling with it, please let me know. The idea is that you have the account ready, and when you're done with your final projects, the interview of the central administrator and the field study, your paper that you're working on with your partner or partners, you're going to upload it to TaskStream. Make sure you select the correct course. It's Issues in American Education. Make sure you find my name and look for it, and there are plenty of instructions once you're ready. You're going to do that before the course ends. You're also going to upload everything to Blackboard as well, so we can read each other's papers and talk about amongst ourselves what we learn. So for the next unit, we're going to go a little deeper into instruction and talk about using data and how we use data. I know that's been a big push to use data to inform instruction and decision making, and why do we use data? How can we use data? And how to make our teachers good at themselves examining data, making them responsible for the data, setting school-wide goals that are connected to the data that we have collected, having students examine their own data, and making sure that that becomes part of the instructional plan. Now, first of all, there has to be a reason for people to do anything. We kind of established that in the last unit. How if teachers are not on board, they're not going to be that excited about it. And sometimes it's hard to get people excited about data, isn't it? I teach a course where it's all about numbers and data and statistics, and people are just like really not excited. So what we want to do is not necessarily pepper it or salt it and tell people this is wonderful, this is terrific, but have people learn to feel competent, at least competent with it. So if they feel competent with it, at least they're going to feel a little less disengaged, and we want that to happen. So not everybody is a math geek, and not everybody is fond of numbers. So maybe the idea is to stress the vision, the setting of vision for the whole school, and where we started, where we are going, and where we want to be in the future. So it's kind of like working out. If you don't know what your capacity is when you start working out, you're not going to be able to set a workout goal. Even if your capacity is you just walk around the corner, at least you know what your baseline is. So sometimes it's good to give people some real life examples so they don't get, oh, why are you giving me all these numbers and what does it matter anyway? One of the things that we can do is look at, there are mounds and mounds of data out there, and we have to determine what is important in terms of looking at data. Why do we look at certain data streams? And if we're comparing data for our own school, that's a little easier for teachers to swallow. Teachers don't like necessarily looking at their own data so much, or looking at the data across the peer schools. I think there's a lot of defensiveness, but I think the idea is that people have to start understanding that that there needs to be an evidence-based component to the work that they do. That they can't just say, well, this worked because this is the way it's always been, but what is the evidence and how can we study it? So one of the easiest things to do in terms of evidence is to find a way to measure growth in students. And that's really hard with standardized tests because they just tell you the score of that particular test and when we have prepared the student for that test. But in order to get some kind of growth element into our picture, we want to know where the student started in September, where they ended in June, and perhaps a benchmark in the middle of the year to assure that they are going in the right direction. So rather than look at every single subject and every single aspect of the subject, we can just start with pinpointing where it is we want to measure and where it is we want to grow. So first, let's start at the beginning. Let's give them some good background on why we look at data. So data can be helpful to know exactly what skills to work on for the student. There's no sense in teaching or reteaching the same skill that they have mastered. Students will get bored. I mean, you can do a review, but why spend a lot of time on a part of the curriculum where students have mastered the data or a skill? It's hard when the classes are big, but since you're going toward team teaching, not all of you have it, it's a good idea to have these measures in place to know where exactly to start teaching. So that has to do with prioritizing instructional time. So data can help you, teachers and assistant principals prioritize instructional time. We don't want to teach everything under the sun. We want to teach specific units or specific skills, in fact. And if you have students who are needy, we really want to pinpoint where the deficits are. Oh yeah, we want to capitalize on strengths, but we also want to pinpoint those deficits so we can work on those deficits. The collection of data doesn't have to be necessarily hard data. We can find a way to collect evidence about student strengths, weaknesses, learning styles, and other interventions, instructional interventions that help a student to learn. And there are learning assessments out there, but teachers can simply compile a list of strengths and weaknesses for students in the class. They can hone in detail-wise and go very detailed on the exact strengths and weaknesses, or they can do something a little more global. It depends on what they're working on. Okay, so data can also help you gain instructional effectiveness of the classroom lessons. Teachers should design teacher-made assessments, formative and summative. Formative means ongoing, and it doesn't have to be a test. It can just be checking for understanding. And obviously summative means the end unit tests and of course your formalized tests. So data can help us gather, and gathering data can be as simple as designing a pre-test and a post-test if you want to get that fancy. Also, the pre-test can be a great study tool that I know people will say, I don't have time in the curriculum. Well, can you afford to spend time just shooting arrows in the dark? Not necessarily. Gathering data can help you understand what the students know and what they don't know. On the school-wide level, we can examine data to know how to adapt the curriculum. That could be used in curriculum meetings, faculty meetings. And another helpful form of data is looking at peer schools or peer groups across either the schools that are similar or state or national, or if you want, you could break that down into specific groups, comparing students to groups of special ed students, comparing students to regular general ed students. So back to the purpose. We know that although accountability is the big buzzword that teachers don't like so much, data doesn't have to taste like medicine. It can be very, very simple. For example, what if a teacher took let's say they have 12 students in the class, in an ideal world, yes, of course. They give one exam, and it's a math exam, and they take all their scores and they make a chart to compile the specific questions where students really struggled. This is called item analysis, and this is really helpful to teach or reteach or see why the students got the answer on those particular questions. The answers on those particular questions wrong. Okay, this is very scientific. They can either reteach the material, or you can divide up into special groups, or they can use differentiated instruction, or approach the situation differently, or even something as simple as maybe the test itself is a poor design. And collecting data such as simple as item analysis on the classroom level is really wonderful. But we can also do that on a school-wide level. For example, if you're giving a standardized test and you see, for example, in New York it would be called the Regents, we could look at all the students on the English Regents, and if perhaps they all got question 10 wrong, we can look at how to really go and teach that material so the students won't, you know, bollocks it up and, again, that they will have some mastery. And some of these tests are designed so the questions are very similar. So giving them good practice will have them able to work at it. So what else can we use data for? I mean, absolutely it can be helpful to create the school vision. It can be helpful to see where the needs are in a school. And creating a data-driven culture is not something that happens overnight. There has to be an emphasis on teams and teachers working together to look at statistics, hard and soft, to see if there's some growth, there's some change. Now, going back to measuring growth, student growth, I think that's a very good way to measure data that is not usually used that often. It's used, sometimes it's used in the elementary schools here, and there's something called a diagnostic testing where people give a one-to-one test where they're able to figure out specific words that the kids could read and so on. And then at the end of the year, if they're really organized, they will take and give the student the diagnostic tests again, and they will be able to measure growth. Now, some of these tests are configured in grade levels. So if a kid is in the 4th grade, but he's reading on the 2nd grade level, we have a reading grade level that will show, if he's still on the 2nd grade level or if he's gone up a grade equivalent. And that's a good way to measure growth, but that is not the only way to measure growth. Sometimes the teachers are leery of giving tests, the same test at the beginning of the year and the same test at the end of the year. They don't want to measure whether there's growth in the content because they think there's too much content being taught. And I will beg to differ with that, because if they don't master the content, then there's problems the next year. So it's a good idea to sometimes keep up that growth, the way of measuring growth, by giving some of the same concepts in the same test throughout the year, beginning of the year, end of the year. So that's a way to collect data, measuring growth, comparing a student themselves to themselves, not themselves to others, but themselves to themselves. I mean, there's all kinds of tests out there where teachers are comparing usually percentage right, percentage wrong, but to compare a student himself to himself scientifically doesn't happen as much as it should. We used to do this in reading programs, especially if we were taking kids into the high school. We wanted to know, from the junior high school, we wanted to know their reading level and what they started with in junior high school, so we could scientifically measure them when they came through a year of a high school remedial reading program. Actually, it wasn't allowed to be called remedial, but it was called the academy program, and we measured their growth before and afterwards. So that's one way of collecting data. The principal kind of has to set the tone to have different data-driven instructional teams going on, and to collect data, and also to have a point person who is the data person, but the principal ultimately decides what he's going to do with those amounts of data. When this sort of trend came out at first, people were like, well, what do you want me to do with all this data? Data, data, data. But the data has to be connected to something. So I'm going to talk about feedback, which sort of goes into the last lesson. We talked about feedback as a very important tool, and a lot of you said that people rail against supervision, but feedback is great. Some people went into it in depth, and some people just kind of breezed on